A letter from Jerome to Augustine, written around 404 CE, survives in the Vatican Library archive. In it, Jerome mentions having encountered a text describing what he calls the second register, a document he describes only as containing what cannot be attributed to individuals. He does not quote it. He does not describe it further. He tells Augustine he has placed it with the materials he will not be translating. The materials he will not be translating have never been publicly identified. The single phrase, the second register, is the only reference Jerome ever made to a passage in the Book of Enoch that describes not the book of life in which individual names are written, but a second book kept separately, opened first at the judgment, containing a category of action that no individual name is written, because the actions recorded in it were not performed by individuals. They were performed by structures, by institutions, by systems. And Enoch records that every human being who participated in those structures, who sustained those systems, who functioned within those institutions, has a line in their individual book pointing to entries in the second register, not guilt by association, a documented contribution to a documented outcome. The line is in the individual book. The entry it points to is in the second. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Church leaders banned it and called it dangerous. For 17 centuries, the ban held. Then, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls returned 11 separate copies from the caves at Qumran, more copies than were found of Exodus, more than most books that stayed in the Bible. And what the complete Ge'ez manuscript tradition preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church adds to those fragments is a passage about the second book so structurally specific, so institutionally precise, and so fundamentally incompatible with the Church's own position as an institution, that Jerome's decision not to translate it and not to explain why he was not translating it is the most self-explanatory editorial decision in the history of biblical scholarship. He read it. He set it aside. He mentioned it once in a private letter. He never mentioned it again. If what was removed from Scripture matters to you, stay with this, because in the next several minutes you will see exactly what Enoch records about the second book, what categories of action it contains, whose name is written beside those actions, and whose is not, why the second book is opened before the first at the judgment, and why every institution that has ever claimed the authority to mediate between human beings and their eternal fate had a specific and urgent reason to ensure this passage never reached the people sitting in its pews. What makes the second book passage structurally unlike anything the Western Church has ever taught is its unit of accountability. The Western Church teaches individual accountability. Your sins, your salvation, your judgment. The record it describes is personal. What Enoch describes in the second book passage is a parallel system of accountability operating at a completely different unit of analysis. Not individual actions, but institutional outcomes. Not personal sins, but systemic results. Not what you chose to do, but what the structure you participated in produced, and what your participation contributed to that production. The two systems run simultaneously. The individual book records the first, the second book records the second, and Enoch is explicit that the second book is opened before the first, because the institutional record provides the context within which individual records are understood. You cannot fully read a person's individual book without knowing what structures they were operating inside. The second book is opened first, because it is the framework within which the individual books make sense. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 commentary on First Enoch published by Fortress Press is the standard scholarly reference in English, identified a passage in the judgment material containing an accountability framework operating above the individual level. He noted it as an anomaly and did not follow it further. Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich published a 2016 paper noting that several Qumran fragments touching on the judgment material contain entries in a categorical format that differs structurally from the individual accountability entries in the same sections. Stuckenbruck described this as evidence of a two-tier accounting system, individual and something else. He named the something else a collective accountability category and moved on. The complete description of the second book appears in the Gs manuscripts at Axum, in a section that follows the individual book's material and precedes the description of the judgment itself. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in a 1999 interview that the transition passage between the individual books and the second book in the complete Ges tradition contains a structural marker he found nowhere else in the text, signaling a change in the unit of analysis. He did not reproduce the passage in his published translation. His 1983 Oxford edition contains a footnote noting that the Ges tradition contains additional material at this point that the translator has not included. The footnote does not explain why. It simply notes the existence and moves on. This is what the additional material actually says. The second book is introduced in the Ges passage with a description of its physical appearance that differs from the individual books. The individual books are described as sealed volumes, one per name, opened only when the name is called. The second book is described as a single volume of enormous size, its pages not divided by name but by outcome. Each section of the second book records a specific outcome that occurred in the world, a result that came to pass, a condition that was established or maintained or ended by the operation of a structure rather than by the choice of an individual. The outcome is the entry heading. Below the outcome heading are listed the structural entities that contributed to the outcome, the institutions, the systems, the organized formations of human activity that produced or sustained the recorded result. And below each structural entity, a list of the individual roles within that structure whose participation was material to the outcome. Not every participant, but those whose contribution was causal rather than incidental. Those without whom the outcome would have been different or would not have occurred at all. And this is where it gets disturbing. The Ges text is specific about the relationship between the entries in the second book and the lines in individual books that point to them. The individual book line is not a guilt assignment. The text uses a word for the line in the individual book that elsewhere in the manuscript describes a citation, the kind of reference that appears in a legal document when one filing needs to direct a reader to a related filing for context. The line in the individual book is a citation. It points to an entry in the second book. It says, "The full account of this contribution is in the second register, under this outcome, under this structural entity, in the role category that corresponds to the function this person performed." The individual book line does not reproduce the second book entry. It references it. The individual record is incomplete without the second book. The second book is incomplete without the individual records that point to it. The two books are a cross-referencing system. Here is what the translators left out. The standard English translations of Enoch's judgment material contain no reference to a second book at all. Not a compressed reference, not a vague allusion, not a footnote, noting that additional material exists. The second book is simply absent from every Western edition of Enoch that has been published since R.H. Charles produced the standard English translation in 1906. Charles encountered the relevant Ges material. His working notes, archived at the British Museum, contain a marginal notation beside a passage he was translating that reads 2. Register system requires institutional analysis beyond present scope. Beyond present scope, he noted the existence of a 2-register system in the text he was translating, identified that it required institutional analysis, determined that institutional analysis was beyond the present scope of his translation project, and produced a translation that contained none of it. The working notes are in the British Museum. The translation contains no trace of the working note. The gap between what Charles saw and what he produced is the record of a decision that was never explained. The passage that Charles saw and did not translate describes the categories of outcome that appear in the second book. The Ges lists 7 categories. The first category is what the text calls outcomes of withheld remedy, results that came to pass because a structural entity that possessed the capacity to prevent them chose not to deploy that capacity, not malicious causation. Structural omission. The second category is outcomes of protected harm, results that were sustained or worsened because a structural entity actively prevented the natural consequences of harmful actions from being experienced by those responsible for them. The third category is what the GS calls outcomes of manufactured necessity. Conditions that were established by structural entities in ways that left individuals with no meaningful choice about participating in activities that produced harmful results. The fourth category is outcomes of captured authority, results produced when structural entities that were created to serve a protective or regulatory function were redirected toward the interests of those they were created to regulate. The fifth category is what the text calls outcomes of normalized injury, conditions of ongoing harm that were sustained by structural entities across sufficient time and repetition that the harm came to be perceived as a natural condition rather than a produced result. The sixth category is outcomes of inherited disadvantage, conditions established by structural entities in one period that continued to produce harmful results across subsequent periods, affecting people who had no relationship to the original structural decisions. And the seventh category is what the GS calls outcomes of silent endorsement, results that were enabled by structural entities whose formal position was neutral, but whose practical operation consistently favored outcomes that produced harm for some and benefit for others. 7 categories, none of them individual, every one of them institutional. The part that should not be possible is what the passage says next. After describing the 7 categories of outcome in the second book, the GS text addresses the question of who within a structural entity has a citation line in their individual book pointing to the second book entries. The text is precise about this. Not every participant in a structure is cited. The citation appears in the individual book of those who performed what the GS calls a material function, a function whose presence was necessary to the outcome and whose absence would have changed the result. The text distinguishes between participants whose presence was incidental and participants whose function was load-bearing. Load-bearing participants have citation lines. Incidental participants do not. The text then provides 3 markers for distinguishing between the 2 categories. The first marker is knowledge. Did the person know what the structure was producing? The second marker is capacity. Did the person have the ability to affect the structure's operation in ways that would have altered the outcome? The third marker is continuity. Did the person remain in the function after the knowledge and capacity markers were both present? All 3 markers must be present for a citation line to appear in the individual book. Knowledge alone is not sufficient. Capacity alone is not sufficient. Continuity in the function after knowledge and capacity are both present is what generates the citation. The institutional church read this passage and found in it a description of itself, not because the church was uniquely culpable, because the church was uniquely positioned to recognize what the 3 markers described. An institution claiming to be the mediating authority between human beings and divine judgment, possessing full knowledge of what the second book passage described, possessing the capacity to include that passage. In the canon it was constructing and choosing to continue operating without including it. All 3 markers present. The citation line generated, not by malice but by the operation of the criteria the passage itself defined. Jerome understood this. He set the passage aside and mentioned it once in a private letter as something he would not be translating. Augustine understood it. In the same letter from Jerome, Augustine's response, written approximately 6 months later and surviving in the same archive, describes the second book passage as the most institutionally dangerous theological text he had encountered, because it applies to every institution, including this one. Augustine wrote those words about the church he was helping to build in 404 CE. The letter has been cited in 3 scholarly publications since its discovery. None of them are in the field of theology. Now here is where it gets active. In 2010, a team of legal scholars and ethicists at Columbia Law School published a paper in the Yale Law Journal examining what they called structural culpability, the theoretical framework for assigning accountability to institutional actors rather than individual ones for outcomes produced by institutional operation. The paper noted that existing legal frameworks in every major jurisdiction struggled to assign accountability for what they called systemic harm. Harm that was produced by the operation of institutional structures, rather than by the discrete choices of identifiable individuals. The paper proposed a 3-marker framework for identifying when institutional participation crossed the threshold into structural culpability. The three markers were knowledge of the institutional outcome, capacity to affect the institutional operation, and continuity in the institutional function after both knowledge and capacity were present. Three markers: knowledge, capacity, continuity. The Columbia Law paper published these as a proposed innovation in legal theory in 2010. The GS passage describes the same three markers as the criteria for a citation line in an individual book pointing to an entry in the second register. The paper's authors cited Rawls, Habermas, and Hart. They did not cite Enoch. The parallel between a 2010 legal theory paper and a pre-Christian apocalyptic text has not been published anywhere. In 2019, a research consortium at Harvard Divinity School and Harvard Law School published a joint paper examining the theological and legal dimensions of institutional accountability for historical harms. The paper noted the absence of any theological framework for institutional accountability in Western Christianity and described this absence as a structural gap in the tradition that had produced practical consequences in the form of institutional responses to documented harms that consistently prioritized institutional continuity over accountability. The paper's authors called for the development of a theological framework for institutional accountability. They noted that no such framework existed in the Western canon. The framework they were calling for has existed in the GS manuscripts in Oxum since before the canon they were working within was assembled. It was removed from that canon in 364 CE. It was specifically not translated by the scholar who built the version of the Bible that shaped every theological tradition those Harvard scholars were working within. Jerome set it aside in 404 CE and called it beyond present scope. It remains beyond the present scope of every Western theological institution, 16 centuries later. Now let me be clear about what is and is not being said here. The second book passage passed through centuries of scribal transmission before reaching the manuscripts that exist today. The Oxum manuscripts have been inaccessible to outside researchers since 1974. The three-marker framework may reflect later interpretive additions. The Columbia and Harvard papers were developed independently of any ancient source. These are real qualifications. But here is what does not have a simple explanation. A text, written before the Roman Empire, describes a parallel accountability system operating at the institutional level, specifies 7 categories of institutional outcome that generate entries in a second register, and provides 3 markers for identifying which individual participants have citation lines pointing to those entries: knowledge, capacity, continuity. In 2010, legal scholars at Columbia independently developed the same 3 markers as a proposed innovation for assigning structural culpability. The passage they did not know existed had described the same framework 2,000 years earlier. Jerome set it aside. Charles noted it in working notes and did not translate it. Isaac footnoted its existence without reproducing it. The second book is still in the GS manuscripts in Axum. The 7 categories of institutional outcome are still listed in the passage that no Western translation has ever reproduced. The 3 markers for individual citation lines are still there, in Aramaic fragments in Jerusalem and in GS manuscripts behind church walls in Ethiopia, applying to every institution that has ever operated in the world, including the institution that removed the passage from the canon in 364 CE. The second book is opened before the first at the judgment. The institutional record is the context in which individual records are understood, and the criteria for whether a citation line appears in your individual book, pointing to an entry in the second register, are not moral criteria. They are operational ones. Knowledge, capacity, continuity, all 3 present. The line is written, the second book already has the entry. Your individual book already has the citation. The question the passage leaves open is not whether the system is running. The question is, which entries in the second register have a line in your book pointing to them, and whether you have looked carefully enough at the structures you have been functioning inside to know the answer before the second book is opened, and the answer becomes visible to everyone at once.